Well, this is some Civil War fortifications in the town I'm working on. This is Clarksburg, West Virginia. I've been basically working the last 2 years. It's kind of an interesting place, but I would never really want to live here. Actually, where I live is only like 100 yards down the hill. And I'm between wells right now. Not really doing anything. I get called standby. I get paid half my normal day rate just to sit around waiting for them to say it's time to work again. And I was doing my workout. You can see, got weights. I think there's a mixed opinion when it comes to wearing weights and walking around. When I read The Primal Diet by Mark Sessons, he seemed to think it was a good idea. I know other people who think it causes problems, and you know what? I don't know enough to refute them, but if it's good enough for Goku and Piccolo, it's good enough for me. So I try and walk up here. Everything's pretty steep. These mountains aren't really tall. There's no snow caps or anything, but they're very, very steep. Much steeper than the Rockies tend to be, at least the habited part of the Rockies. So anyway, I didn't want to just make a video about this scenery. Sorry if I'm going to angle this wrong. This is going to be another result of my comments with, not with Anarcho-Pack, but on Anarcho-Pack's video with Miss Sexy Socialist and a couple other of her comrades. This time I wanted to talk about unions. Now, these anarcho-syndicalists are against the state. They say they're against states, but they're vehemently pro-labor. And I was accused of being anti-labor. I'm against labor, even though I am a wage laborer, probably more so than they are. I mean, Anarcho-Pack looks like he's a little kid. If he has a job, I'd be surprised. There's a very, very high unemployment in the UK, and he looks like he's probably a student. Miss Sexy Socialist, I don't know. Maybe she has a job, but I think it's even money that she's probably in college. But it doesn't matter, that's irrelevant. I've been a wage laborer for a long, long time, so I'm not exactly sure why I would be against wage labor. Well, they gave reasons, and they were kind of piss poor, and they were also rather ironic. She quoted Mises, who she called a crank. So name calling is always really good argumentation, but basically Mises supported the state breaking up strikes. And I agree. I'm not a minarchist. I don't believe in the state. I don't think that was right, but in principle what he's advocating is just a strict interpretation of property rights, which is not inherently pro or anti-labor. It's labor neutral. If you're pro property rights, then you're pro the property rights of laborers as much as you are for capitalists. Let's look at it hypothetically. If I'm just sitting at home one day and some fellows show up and they say, well, we want to shovel your driveway or mow your lawn, or any number of other tasks that are pretty common around households. There's a couple things that could happen. I could say sure, and then we could negotiate a price, and they either say that's too high, that's too low, and maybe we come to an agreement, and maybe they go ahead and do it and I pay them. Or maybe I say I don't really want those services done at all, or I don't want them done by you, or I'll take care of them myself. And they could either accept that or not. They could say, well, we're going to do the services anyway, and so, watch out, we're going to come and mow the lawn, or whatever it is they're insisting on doing. Or maybe we make an agreement to do, exchange. It doesn't have to be money. There's no principal difference in the exchange if we barter or if we use the most liquid good in an economy, aka money. But if they decide that they want more remuneration than we agreed to, or if they decide they want me to hire them even if I don't want them there, then I'm perfectly justified in removing them from my property. Now, there are anarcho-capitalists out there. In fact, there was one on YouTube, although he never made many videos, who called himself anarcho-authoritarian. And their view is if you own property, then you're basically God. And just to take it to the extreme, you could be sitting on your front lawn, and if a girl was skipping by and her hand accidentally, waft into your property, that you could execute her instantly for trespass. Well, I don't agree with that, and I'd say there's nothing that can stop you from doing that, but if you did do that, then the girl, if she didn't die, or her relatives, if she did, would be able to seek damages. They'd be able to say, hey, how about some proportionality here? Yeah, she trespassed, so slap her hand out or call her name. Don't kill her. That's way overboard, and so we want damages. So if these two workers who want to mow my lawn, are insisting on doing it, and I say no, I can remove them from my property. I can threaten them. If they refuse to go, I can escalate until they make them leave. And this could hypothetically go all the way to killing. I don't think it would make sense if I just immediately pull out a gun and killed them both right there on the spot, or decapitated them with my katana or anything like that. But I wouldn't be obligated to suffer their indulgence. I have no obligation to allow them to work upon my property, let alone to expect remuneration for doing so. And if for some reason I feel like they're enough of a threat to me that I want to get some help, sorry, the camera is going to be all over the place, maybe hire a defense agency, maybe one called the Pinkertons, just for some random name that has no historical connection to the scenario we're talking about, then that would be fine too. And that's just straight up property rights. It has nothing to do with being pro or against labor. Now, the scenarios, the nightmare scenarios that socialists of all types, Democrats too, and anarcho-syndicalists specifically, they refer to a number of major labor disputes, mostly in the late 19th and also the early 20th century, like the Pullman strike, one or two others. And Standard Oil had a couple, Carnegie had a couple, Henry Ford had a couple. These are all people, by the way, that I have fairly bad opinions of for other reasons. Right now I'm reading a book about the foundations of Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, and there's a lot of stuff I already knew that I didn't like about them. But if they own a factory, which they did, and if they didn't, hypothetically someone else could, they're not obligated to give labor to anybody, to give employment to anybody. And if you don't like the situation you have there, unless you have some kind of contractual agreement to the contrary, which is actually quite common, then you can't disrupt them. And if you are disrupting them, they have every right to kick you off. And in all these cases, they would have private security. Sometimes actually the Pinkertons. Sometimes they just hire people, strike breakers or whatever. Strike breakers are the people who replace the workers. That's different. But the really bad ones that they always talk about, the ones that they always cite, at some point they don't call the Pinkertons, they call the National Guard, or they call the government, basically. And they have the military come, whether it be the state militia military or the federal military, and then they have them break up the strike. Now, there aren't any really libertarians, I guess, other than Mises, certainly not anarcho-capitalists though, who would agree with that. And no one can look at that scenario and be like, there's a free market at work. Anytime you're talking about federal troops or the National Guard, then you're talking about something other than free market capitalism, by definition. And so the idea that free market capitalism entails the use of state militaries, it's just oxymoronic. I guess you could hypothesize and say, well, there'll be private defense firms, and I think there'll be something akin to that. I don't know if they'll be explicitly like firms. No one knows what they'll exactly be like. So I guess you could say hypothetically these situations could arise, You could have, in a free market society, you could have a factory who has a labor dispute and the workers go on strike and they hire Mad Dog Defense Agency or whatever, and they come and violently break up the strike. But honestly, the workers don't have a right to just come there and obstruct the property of the owner. And the other thing is, I don't have any problem with people organizing into unions if they want to do it. I've kind of done it before. I didn't explicitly form a union, but as I talked about in other videos, my company broke off into two companies. The two owners, although they disputed who was the actual owner or not, got into an argument. They hated each other, basically, or came to hate each other. This lesson: you should never go into business with your best friends, because you end up not being best friends usually. Anyway, they both wanted all of the employees to go with them, and they got in a fight over it. And I was out in the middle of nowhere, and we didn't have a lot of employees, but there was me and one other guy out there, and we were getting solicited by both of them. Both of our phones were ringing with messages of "come work for me," because they needed us. If we weren't there to do the job, then they'd lose the work entirely. We were working for an oil company. The oil company wanted, me and this other guy to be doing it, and whoever we decided to work with. And so we stopped answering the phone, and we talked to each other for about half an hour. And he said, "Well, let's have a uniform front here. Let's put our proposed," I'd say, you could call them demands. I guess it's debatable though. And when it was all said and done, we came up with a list of things we wanted, and we called our boss and we said, "Listen, we'll work for you on these conditions." And we got everything that we asked for, everything. And I guess you could say that's unionizing a little bit. We didn't form an explicit union, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with people wanting to join a union. But this is where it starts to get a little ironic for the anarcho-syndicalists, because unions historically are not based on consensus and democracy. They are wedded to the state fundamentally. With the laws that say that you have to join a union under certain circumstances, and this varies by state to state, that's a huge boon. There's a lot of workers, probably millions of workers, who have been forced to be unionized against their will because of the government. Case in point, my hometown, there's a university. It's a university now. It was a technical college for a long time, and it wasn't a liberal arts college, and so most of the professors were not liberal arts people. They weren't socialists by and large. This has slowly changed over the years. And the National Education Association and the MEA, which is the Michigan branch of the NEA, the teachers' unions, had been trying to unionize this school for years, like literally decades. And they failed repeatedly. I mean, it was all, they had operatives, they would come. Obviously, there were a couple teachers who were in favor of it. So they got nice cushy jobs at the union, and they had repeated votes about whether they should unionize or not. And actually, they were defeated most of the time. This is a weird thing about democracy, where you have a vote, it gets voted down, so that's wrong forever, right? Until you vote again. You get to re-vote, and then it went from categorically wrong and evil to demonstrably beneficial just because of a vote. And what was weird, the law in Michigan, this was in Michigan, not to be too specific about where I'm from exactly. If anyone's curious, there's actually a good book about this whole thing, about this university, and their unionism, because eventually there was a dispute that went all the way to the Supreme Court. I knew one of the plaintiffs from Boy Scouts, actually. Anyway, it's a long story, but eventually they voted like 54% to join a union. So that's 48% were still opposed. But because of the legal system, they then had to join a union. There's no choice. If they didn't join a union, they have, and I don't know if they call it this everywhere, but in Michigan they call it closed shop. That means if you're not in the union, you can't work there. It's very common in public sector unions, at least in schools. Every high school, every place I ever went to school was like this. And so suddenly, because of the state, 47% of the teachers at this university had to join a union or lose their job. So join a union or starve, right? That's coercion, 100% coercion. And it's 100% based on the state. And do you hear any of this from, Miss Sexy Socialist and Anarcho-Cap, they always talk about consensus, and, I would always bring up majoritarian tyranny, and they're like, we don't believe in majoritarian tyranny. Well, so then you're opposed to, majorities, even if they're slight majorities, voting to join a union. Well, then that's fine. And if you oppose that, well, then you're a fascist. You're for government. If you're against government forcing people to unionize, well, then it's just there's a grave inconsistency there, I'm afraid. And there's other things. I don't really like the idea. I think it's stupid to have collective bargaining. Then the incentive is always for people to be less productive. If you could see this in public school teachers are just a perfect the public school system is a terrible system, but there's a huge plethora of teachers in it, and some of them are extremely hardworking and good pedagogues too. That I had a few who knew all about the topics they were supposed to teach. Very, very, very knowledgeable and very hardworking. And I knew other ones who, it's practically like they were on welfare. They had tenure. They literally couldn't get fired. The only way for a school to fire them would have to incur literally hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in legal fees. And that's only if they had done something really bad, like rape somebody, or be alleged of it. And I know of a school where there was a teacher who, for years, there were rumors that he was having sex with kids, and then eventually they caught him having sex with young boys, and they had to make him the librarian. They couldn't fire him. They got him out of a classroom. They had to make him a librarian for a year or two before he finally quit. And the fact that they're all pooled together collectively, their pay doesn't reflect the hardest working teachers I know. They didn't get paid more than the ones who were just collecting a paycheck, getting the best benefits money can buy, bankrupting the state, which that's fine. I don't give a shit. They could bankrupt the state, but then the state comes to me to pick up the tab, and that kind of irks me the wrong way. Rubs me the wrong way, sorry. But, the other thing is, all these egalitarians, they say they love labor, but then they treat it like it's this homogenous good, like every laborer is the same, and that, there's this sea of, the labor force is this homogenous mass of nobodies who can be replaced at a whim. If you are, so if you have a factory and they have a strike, and then the management just says, well, we're going to fire all, 1,000 workers, just replace them with new ones. If they're able to do that, then those workers were not very skilled. They didn't have anything to bring to the table. If they are able to fire their entire workforce like that easily. But and even when I was working though in fast food, they didn't have that kind of power. When I was working at Burger King as a kid, they wanted to be open late. They were open 24 hours, I think 3 or 4 days a week. They were open till 2 a.m. the other days of the week. And most people don't want to work that late. Most people don't like staying up that late. I got used to it. I did it for years, but so the few people who are willing to do it, usually pretty scummy people, drug addicts, not everyone who did it, but not the best people, not highly intelligent, not very skilled, but they were willing to do it. And that meant that very often, even when these people did terrible things like steal, they couldn't be fired because they needed them that bad. They didn't have, even though it was an unskilled job, there weren't enough people on the market that they could just, if they fired them, then they'd have to close. And this is the thing, is capitalists need, there's this kind of this, employees need to have a job. We're coerced because we have to have it. Well, capitalists have to have it too. They can't survive. They can't spend all this money on capital like a Burger King. That probably costs $250,000 to start. A big factory, it could cost $1 billion. Like this Boeing factory in South Carolina or whatever. It costs $1 billion. They can't afford to just spend $1 billion and be like, oh, let's just not, we don't need workers, fuck them. Let's just be real picky. They have to have workers or they'll lose money. This is kind of like, well, if I don't get a job, I won't have any money. Well, if the capitalist doesn't get workers, he'll fucking lose money. He'll lose a ton of money, depending on what kind of industry we're talking about. And $1 billion, there aren't any companies that can just, $1 billion. Even the very largest, that's a big hit. Most of them, that would be the end. Boeing gets a lot of government subsidies, so maybe they can afford it, but that's a different story. So they need workers, and so you have a lot more control over it, and wages get bid up by this process. I described this earlier. Just a $1 or $2 difference is going to mean the difference between having, literally the top percentage of the wage laborers and the lower percentage of the wage laborers, and that makes a huge difference in terms of productivity and usually profitability as well. So I mean, the notion, and there's a whole bunch of other myths. Labor unionism isn't as big in the United States as it is in Europe. That should kind of clue people in, because there's this mythology that, our standard of living, that it's related to labor. We were all poor, and then the capitalists made us even poorer. This is kind of the thing. We had this idyllic past where we lived as serfs, basically, or subsistence agriculture, and then the capitalists came and made it worse somehow by creating there before unknown quantities of consumer goods. So, and then the unions came and they split the pie more fairly. They created the middle class. Well, what decade had the highest percentage of U.S. workers being in unions? Right, this would be the most prosperous decade in American history, right? It was the 1930s, and I know a lot of socialists don't know their history very well, but the 1930s are not typically considered the most prosperous decade in the American century or American history. Not by a long shot. Now, there's other things too. Europe, especially France, Great Britain, Germany, they've all had much, much higher rates of unionization. I think it depends on the country and the time you're talking about, but easily double or triple the rates of union. And they're not double or triple wealthy. Even per capita, they're not. In fact, they're less per capita. I have to check it. It's been changing. The United States has been coming down for a long time. But, I mean, there's no correlation there at all. There's no correlation in our history. Standards of living were rapidly increasing before unionization began. The pace of unionization has never correlated with, if we had the period where unionization was increasing the most, it wasn't with the area that prosperity was increasing the most, and so on and so forth. Like I said, the 30s were the worst decade probably ever in American history, other than the 1860s, first half of the 1860s. But unions as they exist today are totally dependent on the government, and they lobby for it effectively all the time. They don't raise wages. To the extent that they do increase the pie, it's to their own laborers at the expense of consumers. It's not that the fat cats lose out, it's that the pocketbooks of regular people get a lot thinner to pay for the really expensive cars, to cite one of the more popular unions. And I don't see, if you want to just pretend that if you get a raise, it's because the capitalist now has less millions, okay, but even if that's true to an extent, it's also true that all consumers of those goods and the vast majority of goods are not meant for millionaires, despite the fact that people seem to think that capitalism means everything is built for them and not for the middle class. But, your higher wage is just a higher price for consumers. So what's the net effect? You know, if the UAW gets every year $1 billion more in wages and benefits, you know, however you want to put them together, and this comes from $1 billion higher price tag on cars, you know, what's the net effect on society? It's fucking zero. It's zero. Like, yeah, the union, they have higher wages, and everyone who wants to buy a car, well, they had to spend more, so they're subsequently poorer. And, you know, the people on the margins who had, you know, they just barely had enough money to buy a car, well, now they don't. And they don't have a car now, or they have to get an older one or whatever. So this is just pure mythology, just like so much in the socialist worldview. It's just utter make-believe. It's ironic again. I'm always struck by how ironic socialists are. You know, the things they believe in, and then they just, I mean, their arguments are self-defeating. You know, they don't even make sense within the context. I mean, people want to form a union, that's fine. But the idea that they should, then I would say, well, you shouldn't be forced to join a union. Well, then suddenly I'm anti-labor. That's pro-government. But when the government forces people to join a union, that's not pro-government. That's pro-labor. Yes, so we libertarians hate labor. I mean, this is the kind of the epitaph. If you look at arguments against libertarianism and free markets, pretty much all of them consist of some kind of horrible name. Like, they hate the poor, they hate the sick, they hate labor, you know, and then there's this, they want there to be monopolies, you know, they're for the fat cats, and then, of course, that's a non sequitur to call people names like that, but then the justification is then always based on some stupid myth, you know. And that reminds me, I have to do a video about monopoly too. So, yes, if you, in effect, socialists who are pro-labor are pro-government, and if they support the government intervention in the market in this way, they're against private property, they're against individuals, they're majoritarian, because unions are all majoritarian. There are no unions that are based on consensus. You know, Miss Sexy Socialist, who again has no appeal to me, says she doesn't believe in majoritarianism. You know, and her idea, consensus means, like, literally everyone agrees. She uses it to mean unanimity, a process that arrives at unanimity. That's not how unions work. That's fucking bullshit. You know, and it's not like all unions get elected in by only 53%. I'm sure a lot of them get elected in by a much higher. Still, it's a majority. Screw the workers who aren't part of that. Who's pro-labor now? Bitch.